In the early to mid-2000s, there was a new idea generating discussion in the medical field. Stem cells started to become buzzwords that drew the attention of the general public. It also grabbed the interest of anyone suffering from serious medical ailments or disabilities. At that point, most of the U.S. general public knew about it, or at least had heard of it. It eventually found its way into the sphere of celebrities and politicians who saw great potential in its use. Actor Christopher Reeves, who was alive and paralyzed from the neck down at the time, was one of its biggest proponents, hinting how it might be the key to cure his paralysis one day. More and more awareness ads were being put on television screens and on billboards. At first, it was simple curiosity. Then there was interest, but also criticism. Eventually, the interest won out over the critics, at least in the eyes of the public. By the end of the campaign, there was so much support and interest that many believed it was irresponsible not to give public funds to support stem cell research. After all, it could save lives, get people out of wheelchairs, and completely eliminate certain diseases. And then it happened. Governments agreed to fund stem cell research and poured billions of dollars into it. New facilities opened up, and more scientists got grants to research stem cells. Patients with various health problems found hope. They were excited. Many thought it would be a matter of time before there would be a cure for their diseases or disability. So they waited, and waited, and waited. As of the year 2020, and over $3 billion later, very little has come in the way of federally approved treatment. Many people have lost patience, and many in the public are wondering what happened to all the hope and potential. The truth is, what happened in the early 2000s is a lesson. It shows how a confluence of factors and interest groups can sometimes create unrealistic expectations. Sometimes it happens unknowingly, other times deliberately. It all adds up to unkeepable promises, broken hope, and eventually lost faith from the public. Before we can get into this story, we have to understand what stem cells are. Stem cells are non-specialized cells present during early stages of fetal development. These cells differentiate and turn into more specific cells. This happens in animals and plants. Stem cells can be divided into 5 categories based on how specialized they are. They can also be split into 4 categories based on where they are obtained from. Stem cells were first defined by Ernest McCulloch and James Till at the University of Toronto in the early 1960s. But human embryonic stem cells were discovered in 1998. Ever since that discovery, there has been much debate about whether or not their use was ethical. Adult stem cells, which are less controversial, were successfully produced in 2006 after scientists reprogrammed certain adult cells to reverse to a stem cell-like state in a lab. If you want to know more about stem cells themselves, check out our video about their history, science, and potential. But for now, we will get into the story of what happened to the stem cell funding bill known as Proposition 71. It was November 2004 when Proposition 71 had officially passed by 60% of the vote in California. Proposition 71 was the bill to enable the state of California to fund stem cells through the California Institute of Regenerative Medicine, also known as CIRM. This was a culmination of months and years of advocacy by a real estate developer by the name of Bob Klein. The campaign to pour massive amounts of public funds into stem cell research was also supported by big-name celebrities, including Michael J. Fox, Brad Pitt, and Christopher Reeves. For Reeves and Fox, it was personal, as their livelihood was directly tied to this project. Fox was suffering from Parkinson's disease, and Reeves was a ventilator-dependent quadriplegic after a fall from a horse. Stem cells were possible treatments to both of their ailments and offered a glimmer of hope to them and their families. The potential of stem cell research at the time was endless. Paralysis, diabetes, brain disease, autoimmune disease, and much more were what many scientists hoped to eliminate using stem cells. After the ad campaign materialized into wide-scale support, it was followed up by a bill. Proposition 71 was the bill's label, and even more ad campaigns started to give it more publicity. Proposition 71 would be a $3 billion fund for stem cell research in the state of California. Beyond the obvious medical potential to this bill, there were economic benefits as well. Thousands of jobs would be created by the legislation. Many more could be created in private investments that such a large research infrastructure could attract. And if everything went to plan, thousands of lives and millions of dollars could be saved by the state of California. The funds would be dispersed through CIRM. This institute would oversee the funds and the research that was being conducted. But 16 years later, no disease was cured and no treatments were approved. So the question becomes, what happened? Did the stem cells just not live up to what we had expected? Were they a false promise? The truth is, the project was given unrealistic expectations from the get-go. To understand why the project could never succeed, we have to rewind to the days and months prior to the proposition passing. The promises being made in those campaigns were never realistic. In fact, according to CIRM board member Jeff Sheehy, what was promised was simply not deliverable. Sheehy was right in this regard. Many advocates in the public kept portraying stem cells as unrealistic supercells able to heal almost anything. To make matters worse, many emotionally charged tactics were used. Some rhetoric involved asking voters and public officials questions like, "Do you want your son to die? Are you going to wait? Is that the price you are willing to pay?" These statements, while invoking urgency, were indirectly implying some immediate impact with the potential to save lives in the near future. That was blatantly untrue. Simply put, that's not how research-based science works. It also gave false hope to many people in serious conditions. While this is a major ethical problem, the blame didn't lie on CIRM itself. CIRM didn't really have much input in what their advocates or critics were saying to the public. But that doesn't mean CIRM itself was free of fault. Far from it. In fact, it could be argued that CIRM was the bigger reason that Proposition 71 didn't live up to its expectations. CIRM received funds from the state of California. They would give those funds to places they deemed appropriate. A look into their spending showed they granted about 40% of the funds towards basic training of new scientists entering the field. That, although fairly high for training purposes, wasn't entirely unusual or even a negative. The problem was that only 20% went into clinical trials. Clinical trials are single-handedly the biggest expense of any research program trying to find a new treatment. So it seemed somewhat odd that CIRM didn't focus more grants towards research that was already in trial phases. On top of that, most of the clinical trials they supported were conducted between 2015 and 2018. Some of their critics have argued this was a deliberate attempt to diffuse public concerns about the lack of clinical trials up to that point. When adjusted for a dollar-to-dollar basis, federal agencies funded clinical trials at 3.5 times a higher rate than CIRM. Another possible explanation for the lack of success was the structure of CIRM itself. It was a private institution deciding on public funds. Many of the board members had conflict of interest in many funding decisions. It was so much of an issue that the institution had to make rules preventing members from voting on such circumstances where they have vested interest. As a result, there were 1,770 cases of board members abstaining from voting between 2006 to 2018. One board member alone had to abstain from 400 votes. Attempts to bring government oversight was proposed, but was met with staunch resistance from CIRM. This created a negative dynamic which was destroying most of the goodwill that was built up to that point. To be fair, CIRM did do tremendous amounts of work in the regenerative medical field. They published 330 articles in the subject. They also paved the way for 50 clinical trials on patients with various health problems. They did make strides with the resources they were given. But ultimately, it fell well short of expectations. Then there is always the question of how much did the conflicts of interest play in preventing optimal decisions on where the funds were to go. All these things add up to Proposition 71 being close to running out of funds in 2020, with very little to show for. Future bills to continue funding are a possibility, but CIRM is still refusing any more oversight than they had from the first bill. The future seems uncertain. This whole story is an unfortunate case about how misunderstanding and lack of proper information can give a new medical science a bad image. The solution to this situation is not clear. Regardless of what happens, stem cells will have a high potential to cure and help many people. Keep in mind that there are many other institutions and facilities doing important work on stem cells. So luckily, we don't have all our eggs in one basket. There was a lot more to this story, but we had to condense this to keep the video short and to stay on topic. Let us know what you think in the comments section below. And thanks for listening. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe.